So I'm doing my most important succession of carrots, and this bed has had onions in it, just a few little stragglers left. And I'm going to prepare the ground by giving it a good water because it's pretty dry, and carrots, they really need a nice damp surface to germinate on. And then I'm going to cover the whole bed with this topsoil. I normally use spent potato compost, but I don't have any right now, or not enough, so I had to buy a couple of bags. But I don't mind because, as I say, carrots is a hugely important crop for us. These are going to be the ones we're going to be eating all the way through winter and spring. So basically you can think of that as winter and you can think of that as spring. And you can grow a lot of carrots in a bed this size, but it will look like this. So it will have a cold frame top on it. And that's because we leave our carrots in the ground. And that's pretty important for me. They keep so much better in the ground. And by putting the cold frame top on, it just keeps the quality really high. And I need to space them so that I've got gaps in between. And I'll show you that as we go, and I'll explain why. So before I water, I like to make sure the ground's as level as I can kind of get it by hand, just to make sure that I don't get like really wet spots and really dry spots. I want to make sure, I don't really mind a wet spot, so what I don't want is dry spots. And then the best fertiliser I find for carrots is blood, fish and bone. So I want 1 handful per metre squared. And it helps if you're doing this on a windy day to water the ground first. Otherwise it just all blows away. And then water that blood, fish and bone in. So in the end I did find some spent potato compost, and I just harvested some potatoes. And I'm just trying to create a really nice seed bed for the carrots, because like half the battle with a carrot is getting good germination and then minimizing weeding, protecting them from carrot fly, making sure they're in well drained soil, and protecting them from a hard frost. I don't mind a light frost, but a hard frost is not great for them. So, and then kind of creating an environment that's relatively free of slugs and not too wet, hence the cold frame top. But also carrots, they are a very low value crop, so although it's a kind of really important crop for us because we eat carrots every day, it's they're not very expensive in the supermarket, and to make them a higher value crop I like to plant into them in sort of November, late November sort of time, which is when the cold frame lids go on, and that means I get a nice high value crop like spinach or lettuce or something like that in the spring. Turnips, radishes, and that helps increase the yield. And then this bed will be onions next year, just like the bed behind me is onions this year and was carrots last year. So that's the extent of my crop rotation, just not growing carrots in the same bed 2 years running, just in case we got any carrot fly. Because particularly for winter carrots, you probably wouldn't know if you got a little bit of carrot fly in them in November, say, because they don't only damage the roots, but they would potentially overwinter in the soil. So pretty happy with that. So now I'm going to water this in again. A lot of watering involved in preparing a bed for carrots. Not much watering after you've prepared it, but and so now I'm putting this soil out on top, and all I'm really trying to do is create a fairly moisture retentive, weed-free surface for the carrots to germinate in. And this soil, from past experience, tends to be nice and weed-free. And again, I'm just trying to get it as level as possible. I don't worry about lumps and things. You know, carrots will just make their way around little lumps or through them. We're not growing show carrots here, so we don't have to mess around like the growers of who want to show their carrots for competitions. We just want to eat them. So that's looking pretty good. Now we just need a bit of wood and just start roughly marking this out. There's no, well, this is a straight edge, but there's no strings or tape measures or anything like that in my life, so this is plenty good enough accuracy. And I'm leaving a reasonable space in, as I said, because I want to grow crops down the centre here. And so what I do is, when the carrots are fully grown, which tends to be in about November time, I will take the covers off, snip the carrots off, the tops off, so just leave the carrots with maybe 1 or 2 inches of top there. And that means then I can put the cold frame tops on, because otherwise the tops will appear sort of way too high. But it also creates a nice clean environment that's free of slugs, it's free of it's lower humidity, there's no rotting carrot tops around for the snails to hide in, and and in every way it's kind of easier for me to manage. And because the carrots are down here, then there's plenty of space in the middle, and there's no obstruction for me to plant spinach, lettuces, turnips, radishes, and all of that sort of thing. I'll start some lettuces off in November, and they'll be ready in sort of March, April time. And so I always do my favourite spring varieties at that time. And it's a real bonus crop. It's really lovely. So that's a good enough spacing, sort of 6 to 8 inches. So what I'm going to do now is I'm making deep furrows, and I'm making them about centimetre and a half deep, just with the same stick. Because I'm into planting into these beds later, I want to sow in straight lines. If I was not into planting, like I don't interplant, for example, into my summer beds, then I like to do it in a broad drill, where I kind of sow in an area that's sort of 2 to 3 inches wide, and in slightly wider rows as a result of that. And that just makes thinning a lot easier. But I'm not going to do much thinning in these beds, because I'm going to use pelleted seeds. So that is looking very neat. And the next step you need clean hands for, so I'm just going to wash my hands. So I'm going to be using these pelleted seeds, makes it so much easier to get the spacings right. And these are from moles. And the variety I'm sowing is Eskimo, because they're my favourite winter carrot. It might seem strange sowing winter carrot at this time of year, you know, because it is only the middle of May, but they're a really slow growing, dense carrot, Eskimo. And as a result of that, you know, that you just want to give them a long time to grow, basically. It always amazes me that people say, you know, oh, sow carrots every 2 weeks for a continuous harvest. Well, you know, these Eskimo carrots, and most carrots, to be fair, they can stay in the ground really good, in really good condition for a really long time, months on end. And in this case, you know, we actually just finished the carrots that the Eskimo carrots that I sowed at this time of year, middle of May, last week. So the middle of May. So basically, they've been in the ground for a year. They've been fully grown for, you know, 5 or 6 months, and we've just been harvesting them fresh from the ground, crisp and sweet, and actually better than they are in summer, because, you know, carrots that have had a good few frosts on them, or, you know, just being grown in cold weather, basically, are just way sweeter than summer carrots are. And so let's talk about spacing. So I'm spacing these roughly 1 inch apart at this end of the bed. This is the north side of the bed. That's the south side of the bed. And this is where the back of the cold frame is going to be. So the cold frame will open at that end there. So that end's the easy end to harvest. And so there I'm going to plant at a higher density, because I'm going to put salad carrots in at that end and cooking carrots in at this end. And I'll harvest every other carrot at that end. And obviously that's a lot easier to do when it's easier to access. So yeah, I think that should work well. So the salad carrots, I think I'm going to sow at 1 centimetre intervals, and they'll push apart, you know, because obviously 1 centimetre isn't enough space for a carrot to grow, but it is enough when it's got all this space here to kind of push into, and they do. So let's get up really close so you can see me sowing these carrots. So right up to the edge of a raised bed when you're doing this, because carrots are deep rooted, they don't mind, they'll go right down below the depth of the raised bed. Obviously all my raised beds are open bottomed. And also don't, you know, you can fuss too much about the spacing. It really doesn't matter very much. As I say, the carrots will just push apart. What really matters more is the kind of average spacing, because it's as much about, you know, the leaves competing for light as it is the actual spacing between individual carrots. And, you know, the actual spacing is fine because I've got all this space to spread out into. So I'm really pleased with those. Now I'm going to do the closer spacing. I'm going to talk about some of the myths of carrot growing. I love these myths, and I love kind of trying to understand where they came from. And, you know, one of them is never water the soil, always water the drill. You know, so pre-water this drill here, then plant your seed in it, and then cover it over with dry soil. So where does that myth come from? Well, I think it comes from the fact that years ago, before we had weed-free compost mulches, we'll be planting in soil which had been recently disturbed, and it would be full of weed seeds. And so if you watered the soil, you would just get a huge bloom of weed seeds basically at the same time as your carrots are coming up. You wouldn't be able to tell what was carrot, what was weed, and it would be a nightmare. But when you're doing it like this, where I'm using this weed-free surface to plant into, I don't need to worry about that. And so I can get much better germination by making sure that the whole bed is watered and just not worrying about weed seeds. So I think that's where that myth came from. So there's another myth about not planting your carrots too close together, and I think that one comes from the idea that if you put your carrots really close so that the seedlings are touching, they'll merge together into one kind of forked mess, really. And, you know, it tastes just as good, but obviously it doesn't look very good. And so what you want is your seedlings kind of well spaced. And let me get this camera back so you can see what I'm doing. So you want your seedlings well spaced out, so that they're not touching when they're young seedlings. Mature carrots, you know, once they've grown a decent size, they can touch no problem at all. And as I say, they just push each other apart. So hopefully what you can see here is that this side of the bed, I'm sowing them quite a bit closer, just over a centimetre probably, between the seeds. As I say, that's so that I can harvest them smaller. What I found last year was that in the spots where I hadn't thinned very well, or where I'd thinned and then more seeds had germinated, I had the best carrots. Because what happened there was that the carrots were competing with each other and pushing down for, you know, relatively scarce water resources. And so you just got these really long, thin, super sweet carrots. So that's what I'm kind of trying to duplicate intentionally here, whereas last time it was just me being a bit lazy. So when it comes to density, you can play all sorts of games with carrots. You know, so some books will tell you some crazy things like, you know, leave 4 inches or something between each carrot. You know, you're going to grow absolutely enormous carrots. And why do they tell you that? Well, I think maybe it's because really big carrots store better out of the ground. And, you know, I store mine in the ground because I put a cold frame lid over the top. But if you did take them out, obviously they're going to lose moisture. Even if you put them in compost, I've done that. And, you know, there's just no comparison between a carrot stored in compost but with no growing top on it, and carrots left in the ground, tops trimmed, but then the tops start to regrow, and so the carrots are still alive, and so they stay super fresh. So I think that's partly why they grow big ones. Also just old varieties, you know, so can't remember the name of it now, I'll put it up. But the old non-Nance kind of varieties, I only buy Nance type varieties now. But these old ones, they were just really big, huge, in fact. And so they needed more space. I mean, commercial growers now, market gardeners, who can fuss over the carrots like I'm doing, they'll grow at a higher density than me, but then they're not going to be interplanting into the gaps between them. So, that you just take your choice, really. I find this is about optimal. But also their carrots, they're harvesting them younger than me. And they're not leaving them in the ground as long as me. And I don't really know what farmers do, but what farmers do is never very good information to make a decision about what a home gardener should do. So let's talk about protecting them. So right now we are at peak carrot fly time, sort of middle of May, and so we really do need to make sure that when these carrots germinate, we have them protected. And I tend to put Envirotect over them to start off with, just because it's really stretchy and easy to work with. And then I'll put a proper net over the top of them once I've thinned them out and given them a bit of a weed. There won't be very many weeds, and there won't be very much thinning. In fact, hopefully there won't be any thinning. What there might be is a little bit of replanting, because when you're planting like I am at the moment, sowing like I am at the moment, where I'm actually sowing at the density I want them to grow at, so I can't afford any of these not to germinate, really. If I did have a patch where I had poor germination, or if I just had poor germination in general, you've still got time to resow them. So you can still sow these well into June and get a good crop. You could even I've even sown them as late as July, but it's not as good then as sowing them in June or the middle of May. So you've still got time. But also you just get bigger carrots, so obviously I am extolling the virtues of smaller carrots, or a mixture of small and big carrots. But, if you did have a problem with germination, then you would just get a smaller number of bigger carrots. So it's not really a disaster. So what do we do after we finish this? Well, obviously we're going to give them a good water. And it's actually raining now, so the rain's doing a bit of the job for me. That's important with pelleted seeds, especially because you do need to break down this coating. But that happens pretty reliably. Then you need to put your net on. Then you need to keep the bed moist at all times, pretty much, because carrot seeds, they really like to be kept consistently moist for the first few weeks. And then you want them watered every couple of weeks deeply. So on a bed this size, maybe 4 watering cans every 2 weeks if it hasn't rained. And that's because I'm on sandy soil. If you weren't on sandy soil, you'd be struggling to grow carrots as nice as mine, but you would probably not need to water as much because, sandy soil just drains like crazy. So we just had a really good rain shower, which is actually quite useful. And so I'm just going to fold this compost now, actually this soil, over the top. But actually before I do that, I do like to just put a little marker in. And because I've got wood chip paths, I can generally find little bits of wood chip to do the marking. And that just helps me spot where the carrots are, and if there are any weeds, where the weeds are. And then, yeah, just fold over. Now, if you couldn't keep them moist, I can, because I generally come to the allotment once a day at this time of year, generally in the evening, and I'll just give the bed a water every evening, really, if it's not rained. And so I can get away with a 1 centimetre covering. If you're not here as regularly, then you might need to cover the bed with something like hessian or fleece or something like that to keep the humidity higher, or rather reduce the evaporation from the soil surface. Alternatively, sow them a bit deeper. And then we will have to water, unfortunately, just one last time. It really does make a difference to keep the bed nice and moist, and have put a few slug pellets down because slugs are just the biggest threat to newly emerging carrot seedlings. You know, just a few slugs can wipe the whole bed out. So on Thursday, hopefully the wood for this new cold frame top will arrive, and then I'll put the net on. And this year I'm going to use this stuff, which I've been kindly sent, and it's a biodegradable fleece, and it's really soft, so it'll be interesting to see how long it lasts. It's meant to last 2 years, and then you can just compost it. So that makes a nice change from plastic. I do try and avoid soft plastics like fleece wherever I can, so this will be interesting, but also being fine, it might get a bit hot, so we'll have to see how it does. It's worth noting that this cold frame top is going to be quite expensive. I don't know exactly, I'll put up the amount that I had to pay for it when I've actually paid for it, but I suspect that I'll pay for it, I'll get a return on my investment in terms of this extra spinach and lettuce and turnips and radish and all that sort of thing that I can harvest in spring within a year or two. If you want more details on the way I grow carrots, then check out my ebook in the link down below, and yeah, I'll put a link directly to the carrot chapter. My name's Steve, this is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.